So now I have another game to show you, one of my games. This game was played in the Spice Cup Open, a very strong tournament in St. Louis, and I was playing white against a strong master named Aaron Grabinski, who I believe is a student at St. Louis. Aaron comes from Oregon originally, and he's a very good player. I've played him online many times. So in this game, I played d4, and Aaron Grabinski played e6. He's a big time French player, so he wasn't too worried about me going e4 here and transposing to the French. So I stuck with my original plan, which was to play something pretty solid. So I played knight f3, knight f6, and now bishop g5, transposing the position into a torre, which I've played many times. So he played c5, and I play e3, and now the pawns traded. He immediately defined the structure and played b6, which is a common plan and certainly one that I faced many times. Black is seeking to go into some kind of hedgehog structure. So, okay, bishop d3, and bishop b7, castle, and here this is a pretty normal development scheme for both sides. Castle, rook e1, rook e8. The idea of rook e8 is sometimes the black knight is going to leave from f6, and then black prepares to meet. Bishop takes e7 by taking with the rook. So I play c3, but c3 certainly is not the only move here. Sometimes white can play c4 and try to play even more on the queen side for even more space. But I played c3. I wanted to play a rock solid structure in the center. d6. And in these positions, white has to decide whether or not to play for a4. a4 can be very strong if you can cleanly play a5, which I've gotten in before in some games, but the correct way to meet a4 normally is with a6, and then you want to meet a5 with b5, with a very solid position on the queen side for black. So that's why I wasn't so excited to play a4 here, and I played rook c1 instead. So the idea is that my bishop can always fall back to b1 if necessary, and my rook will be developed, and also sometimes I can play for c4. So knight d7, exactly bishop b1, bishop or rook c8, and now I play a3. Kind of a waiting move, and also controlling the square if it becomes useful in the future, because when I play c4, then the square on b4 will be weakened. So, okay, a6. And so here I'd say both of us are playing the waiting game, but now because a6 has been played, it makes sense to put the bishop back on d3, since sometimes that pawn on a6 can be a target. So Grabinski played here knight d5, offering the bishop trade, which is what happened. And here it's very important to keep the knight out of f4, so I played g3, since f4 would be such a strong square for the knight. And here sometimes too there's an interesting plan to play bishop f1, bishop g2, and kind of fianchetto the bishop. So okay, b5, and I play a4 to try to strike out against that pawn. b4, and now exactly c4. I want the space over there. So his knight goes back to f6, and I play knight e4 now, initiating some trade. So I'm trade the knight and play bishop f1 to try to counter the bishop on the diagonal, and I'm hoping maybe I can be a little bit better because my pawns are pretty active and mobile here, and all my pieces are good. So okay, queen b8, bishop g2, and now e5. So black strikes out against the center. And here is a very critical and important position. White has to come up with a plan. So if you'd like, you might pause the video here and try to think how to continue with white. So I played for an energetic plan. I traded the pawns on e5 and then immediately pushed c5 and tried to claim that this pawn is a weapon with my rook behind it. So black played bishop d5, activating the bishop, so that now he's never worried about a c6 push. That makes a lot of sense. And I played knight h4 to trade off the bishops. And that's exactly what happened here. And now queen a7 with pressure on the pawn, so I played queen c2, e4, taking some space, and now queen c4, I improve the position here a bit. Okay, a5, safeguarding the pawn on b4, and I play rook c2, preparing to bring my other rook over, which is what happens. And now, boom, rook takes c5, and here we have our favorite imbalance, two rooks for a queen. So what's going on here? What can we make of this position? Well, it seems like white should be pretty comfortable. We can do the checklist. So the king is safe, right? White has no unprotected pieces, only pawns, so that's a good thing. And white's pieces coordinate reasonably well. Black does have this weak pawn on a5, but white's b pawn is also weak, so white has to be careful that that pawn doesn't get targeted by black's queen. So the position feels like the chances should be good for white. But my reason in selecting this game was because I messed up and I actually got a much worse, possibly even lost position. And so the reason that I picked this game for us to view is because it shows the power of the fortress. But we'll get to that. Before white can create a fortress, white first has to mess up this promising position. So h6, clearing the back rank. So knight e3, bringing the knight into the game. And g6 is a good move because it denies the f5 square for the knight. So okay, rook c4. King g7 is also good. Black's kind of waiting, improving his position. So I kicked the queen, but I feel like I should have been more patient here because with this b3, I allowed this black queen to get very active. And all of a sudden, and I think I had overlooked too, that when the queen takes on b3, she guards f7, which is my target. It's like, oh no, I really messed this up. Um, so queen takes b3, and now black is the one playing for a win. So if we go a few moves back, certainly this b3 was a mistake. Because even if I leave the pawn on b2, and I play something like rook e7, and then another rook to c7, then I don't care about black taking my pawn on b2, because if I take on f7, it's going to be way too much play. So yeah, not the best move b3. So okay, I overlooked some stuff, and now black got a very good position. So okay, he kicked my rook. He would be pretty happy if I wanted to make the trade on f7. Let's see how that would go. So take, 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 take. Now I get the pawn on a5, but I think the problem is his king is too fast. His king's getting in very fast. He wants to bring his king into c3 and push the pawn, and I feel like his passed b pawn with his active king is much stronger than my a pawn here, so I didn't like this. So okay, I play rook e7, rook d7, kicking the knight. So I made the trade, and now here I have to fight for survival. So the black king starts to activate. I basically wait because my idea is that if he takes on a4, I take on f7. So okay, 4, waiting, waiting. I'm fine with a draw. So okay, he played e3, I took, and now he gets to take on a4. But here, my idea, so I forced his king back, and my idea was to win this pawn and then coordinate my rooks, so that as soon as I get the opportunity that I could sacrifice my rook for his two connected passed pawns, which it's really getting to be time for, because there's a principle that two connected passed pawns on the 6th rank, or in black's case here, the 3rd rank, are even much stronger than a rook, that they can overpower a rook. And he doesn't quite have that, but he's close. He's got one pawn on the 3rd rank and one step away. So it really shouldn't be surprising by this point that if white can sacrifice a rook for those two pawns, he's pretty happy to do that. And the reason that I had that goal in mind, I wasn't 100% sure that the resulting endgame is a book draw, but I felt like I would at least have really good chances because all of the ingredients are there for white to get a fortress, and we'll talk about what those are here in a moment. So Queen D2 was played. Now, okay, this was a pretty devious move because he allowed me to do what I wanted, but there's a caveat, and that is that he has this check, and it's not even a fork because I can play rook f3, but the problem is now what do I do next? I'm completely stuck. I have absolutely no moves, so here I'm just lost by Zugzwang. No moves. If I play g4, he takes with the pawn and wins my rook. So it was a generous offer he made, but I had to decline and say, okay, I'm going to wait a little bit. Okay, so now he gave me the chance, and I went for it because he's ready to play here, a3, a2. So time to sacrifice. And so here we reach a position with rook and three pawns against queen and two pawns. So why did I have hope that this position was fortressable? Well, the main thing is that everything is on one side of the board. So remember, we've talked about queen versus rook or queen versus two rooks in the same terms that we spoke about bishop versus knight, in that the queen is more like the bishop. It's the fast piece that craves action and thrives when there's action, whereas the side with the rook wants a more slow, plodding kind of game. So having all the pawns relegated to the same side of the board means that there's not going to be much action. Everything's just on one side of the board, and the power that the queen has over the rook might not get a chance to show. So in order to come up with a fortress, you want everything on one side of the board. You want to be sitting on all the breaks in the position. So you want to try to have everything kind of blockaded and stuck, which white is doing a pretty good job of here. This pawn is stuck. Now he still has an F pawn advance, but as long as I can keep that under control, it's very hard for him to break the position. So my plan has to be to stay in the same place to try to keep the position the same. And he has to have some way of being able to try to break through my fortress. Um, Very often that's done by Zugzwang. Sometimes the position is such, like, I mean, for example, let's say that I just stick my rook on f4 as soon as I can. If I never have to move anything, I mean, there's no way that he can really win that position. But very often these positions are lost because of Zugzwang, because at some point you do have to make a move and compromise your fortress. And also, I guess I shouldn't quite say that there's no way I could lose that position because maybe in some moment he could sacrifice on f4 with his queen and go to a king and pawn endgame that in the right situation could be winning for him. So that's something that I have to be aware of too. That's one of the most typical ideas for how to break through a fortress is sometimes if you still have pawns on the board, you can sacrifice your queen for your opponent's material in order to break through the fortress. So Grabinski played queen f5, so I played king g1. Okay, queen e4. I kick the queen away, and see, I just want to wait. I'm thrilled if I can just wait. So basically, the rule of the fortress is wait until your opponent forces you to do something. So he hasn't forced me to do anything yet, so I can keep waiting, and I did. So now eventually, what he did was he waited for the right time to push f4. Now here, I have to say that I'm extremely indebted to Grandmaster Sam Shankland. Actually, that is U.S. champion Grandmaster Sam Shankland. Congratulations to him on that. One time, just in passing at a tournament, He showed me that a position with, for example, for white, a rook and a pawn on f2 with the king there in the castle position against a queen and h pawn is a draw by fortress. And that had never really crossed my mind, and it didn't seem logical to me that such a position should be a draw. It felt to me like it should be winning. But he told me that it's a draw, and he explained to me why it's a draw, and it made sense. And I was like, okay, well, I'm glad to know that. I don't think it's ever going to come up. Well, here we go. every 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 theoretical endgame that you learn can rear its head at some point. So in this position, white can't hold everything. The H pawn is lost. But thanks to Sam, I knew that at least this should be a theoretical draw. So the reason for that is I can wait. I can stay in the same place and keep everything as is, check him as much as I can. And because of the pawn on f2, I always have the ability to move my rook back and forth. And because his pawn is a rook pawn, it makes it basically impossible that he's ever going to be able to sacrifice his queen and break through the fortress that way. Because king and pawn endgames with only a rook pawn are never winning when the opponent's king is home. So in order for him to try to win, he's going to have to try to create a zugzwang. And that's exactly what Mr. Grabinski does. So he brings the pawn to h4, and that makes a lot of sense because it denies the g3 square from the rook. So I no longer have that as a transfer square, and my danger of getting into zugzwang is a lot worse. But the good news about when his pawn is on h4, denying the g3 square, is that it makes it harder for him to control the h3 square. So now my plan is to transfer my rook back and forth between e3 and h3. So that's what I go about doing. Now, anytime he makes a threat, I have to combat that. Okay. And now he's ready to start checking with his queen. Now, and that's what's cool about this fortress is even after these checks, I can play king h2, and it looks like the rook should be vulnerable on h3, the black's king on g4, but it's actually not. Black actually cannot check the king away from the rook. So the rook's actually not vulnerable. So that's something that's important to know about this fortress. All right, now I want to give you guys a chance to use some of your creativity, and I'm going to give a shout out to one of my longtime best students, Cole Frutos. Now, one thing that I remember about my lessons with Cole is a very strong young player who's played in world youth tournaments and I believe he's won national championships for his age group. He's a very strong, talented kid. But when Cole was a beginner, when he was first starting out, he would always tell me during the lessons. I would show Cole a position and ask him to find the best move, and he would always tell me that he knew what the worst move was in the position. So I guess that's a good thing to know what the worst move is. But what I want to give you the chance to do here is to find a realistic way, a somewhat realistic way, that black could actually lose this position if he's not careful. So if you need more time, you can pause the video. But the idea I had in mind, because the nature of the position is that the rook on h3 is guarded by the king, and black wants to try to interfere with that, so he can snake check with the queen. He can give these checks that bring the queen closer and closer. But now, if he snake checks all the way here, what's going to happen? F3 check, and white's going to win the game. So just something that black has to be a little careful about. It's happened before that people get such a sense of security that their position's unlosable that they let their guard down a little bit and let things like that happen. I believe that's what Grandmaster, or actually he's not a Grandmaster, but Mark Dvoretsky, one of the world's most famous trainers, the late Mark Dvoretsky, would always call these tragic comedies in positions that seemed just completely unlosable, but even somehow a very strong player would find a way to lose the position. So, okay, check. And then here Queen d5 was played, but I was able to keep the fortress the same, and my opponent recognized that he wasn't going to make any progress, and very sportingly, he offered me a draw. A lot of people would continue to play on for 50 moves because why not? You know, black's not at any risk. But I thought that was very respectful of Aaron Grabinski that he realized he wasn't going anywhere here, and so he was ready to call the game a draw. Okay, so now we are going to see one of the greatest games of all time. In fact, one of my first coaches, Dr. Tom O'Connor, when he showed me this game as a kid, he billed it as the greatest game ever played. Of course, that's open to interpretation, but this game certainly does have that reputation. And the game I'm talking about is Alekhine Bogliabov. And this was during the time when Alekhine was one of the best players in the world. Alekhine was a world champion, and he was a great player, a great attacker, and a great strategic player. And his opponent, Grandmaster Efim Bogliabov, of course, he's got one of the best names in the history of chess. I mean, Bogliabov, who doesn't love that? And he was also this larger than life character, this really strong Soviet GM, and he was known for the quote. He would say, when I play white, I win because I have white. When I'm black, I win because I am Bogliabov." So he wasn't lacking in confidence. And Bogliabov was also a tremendous defender. He was well known for his defensive skill and his positional skill, which he certainly put on display during this game. Now, the reason we're looking at this game is I think so far in this chapter, we've been a little bit hard on the queen. We haven't shown a game yet where the queen won against the compensation, and I'd be remiss if I didn't do that because I don't want to paint a picture that the compensation always beats the queen. In fact, it's probably the other way around more often than not. So, and I think, in fact, that's one of the things that makes playing with compensation for a queen fun is you're kind of going against the grain. Like if you sacrifice a queen for something and you win, that's something pretty special. So I think that's what makes it kind of a fun challenge to try to play with compensation for a queen. But I definitely don't want to make it seem like the compensation overpowering the queen is the norm because it's not. So we're going to see the other side of the token. And this game, Bogey above was white, so according to him, he should win because he is white. But he was playing against world champion Alexander Alekhine. So Bogo played d4, and yes, the Bogo Indian is named after Bogliabov. So d4, f5. As so Alekhine decides to play the Dutch. So c4, knight f6, and he plays it kind of like a traditional Dutch with e6. There's three ways to play the Dutch. If he plays g6 and fianchettos on the king side, that's called the Leningrad Dutch. If you play e6 and then the pawn on d6, that's like a classical or traditional Dutch. And there's also another Dutch called the Stonewall Dutch, excuse me, where this d pawn would go on d5 and the this black pawn would go on c6, and black would opt for kind of a stonewall setup with all the pawns on light squares, but he has a very strong dark square bishop and good attacking chances on the king side, and very often in such positions this knight will settle into this square on e4, which is a good square for the knight. So okay, so bishop g2 was played, and now bishop b4 check, which doesn't seem like such a common idea, but maybe, maybe it is a good idea to try to play for like d6, e5, and almost play it kind of like a Nimzo Indian. So okay, bishop d2, and so now they trade, and okay, I guess white could take with the queen too, but he decides to take with the knight. So knight c6, immediately targeting the pawn. Bogliabov develops with knight f3. So both sides castle. And now d6, preparing a Nimzo Indian kind of plan where black might play for e5. And also black might play to try to put a knight on e4. So, okay, queen b3 with some pressure on the b7 and e6 pawns. King h8, that prophylactic move makes a lot of sense. Get the king out of dodge and maybe prepare to play e5. Oops, spoiler alert. So here, white played queen c3, but Alekhine played e5 anyway, even though queen c3 was probably played to deter e5, right? Bogliabov saying, look, I've got another piece controlling e5. Alekhine goes, oh, that's cool. I'll play e5 anyway. So what's his thinking there? So if everything trades on e5, then the knight on d2 would be left hanging, and black would pick it up and be up a piece. So that's the idea. So e5, so white plays e3, and now a5. Well, that move gives scope to the rook on a8, gives black control of b4, and I suppose also prepares to make a new queen. Oh, there's a little bit of a spoiler alert. So b3, queen e8, which is a very typical idea in these kinds of positions to try to bring the queen out to h5 and attack on the king side. This position actually very much resembles a closed Sicilian Grand Prix attack with the colors reversed. So black is using a plan that white would very often use in that Grand Prix attack to try to bring the queen out to h5 and then maybe play like f4 and then bring the bishop in and bring the knight in and try to have a party on white's king side. So, okay, white played a3, so queen h5, exactly. And here, Bogo played h4. So, preventing any kind of checkmate ideas on the h file. But one problem with playing h4 is you can't play h3. It's important to remember that pawns can't move backwards. So that g4 square is weakened, and the knight on f6 says, don't mind if I do. He hops on in there to g4. So white plays knight g5. So bishop d7 now developing and supporting the knight on c6. So f3, he kicks the knight back to f6 and now plays f4. e4, locking up the position. So rook from f to d1. h6, kicking the knight out, so it has to go back to h3. And here we have a really closed, locked kind of game. Black plays d5, knight f1, getting the knight out of the way of the rook. Knight comes back to e7, supporting all the pawns. a4 now. Knight c6 back because white's just created this hole on b4. Rook d2. So, okay, knight settles into b4. Bishop h1, I think in order for the rook to have the scope along the h file. Or I'm sorry, along the second rank. So black plays his queen back to e8. And now rook g2, possibly considering a future g4 advance. So now Alekhine takes on c4, and Bogolyubov decides to take with the pawn, actually sacrificing the pawn on a4, which Alekhine gobbles up. But now white plays knight f2, possibly playing for g4, so bishop back to d7, putting a stop to that. Knight d2, b5, and knight d1. So we have a very interesting position. The black knight settles into d3, but now rook takes a5. And this is where the game gets interesting. So white takes back his pawn, but black plays b4, very logical move. The pawn supported by the knight, the rook is cut off. But Bogolyubov says, okay, let me go ahead and take the rook, and I'm not too worried about my queen because that rook is attacking black's queen. But Alekhine takes the queen. He takes on c3. Rook takes queen on e8. But now he doesn't take back, and he doesn't even take the knight on d2. He plays c2. What a remarkable move. So this move has a double threat. He's attacking the knight, and he's preparing to queen the pawn. But he's also giving up a rook with check. So for the moment, white is ahead by 2 rooks, but he cannot prevent the black c-pawn from promoting. So, okay, knight f2, he gets his knight out of the way. Pawn promotes to a queen on c1, and now knight f1. All right, so a lot's happened. Let's kind of take a step back and assess everything, and let's count the material. So black has an extra queen, but white has, in compensation, 2 rooks and a pawn. So materially, white's doing very well, but positionally, he's not. White has a lot of problems. So remember what we've talked about when you're playing against the queen. Your king's got to be safe and your pieces have to be protected and coordinated. Well, you can't really call the king safe. The king is under some pressure with the black queen this deep into white's position. And also, okay, maybe the white pieces are protected, but they're not pretty. I mean, look at the bishop on h1, right? I mean, that it'd be generous to even call that bishop an oversized pawn. The knight on f1 is pinned and not doing anything. The rook on g2 is stuck. The knight on f2 is awkward. And the rook on f8 is all the way over here in la-la land. So the white pieces just aren't making a lot of sense here. And that's the nature of black's compensation. So he plays knight e1, attacking the rook, forcing rook h2. And now he grabs a pawn. And here, white faces a very serious problem. And if you'd like, you might pause here and try to figure out black's plan for winning the game very quickly if white's not careful. So black's plan is bishop b5, making a battery with the queen, followed by taking on f1. And it doesn't feel like that should be too difficult to stop, but it is. It's actually very difficult to stop because of the lack of squares for the knight on f1. Because if that knight ever goes to d2, then you could always play like queen e2, attacking the knight, which can't move because it's tied to f1, and then attacking this e3 pawn, and knight f3 is in the air. So What Bogoliubov does is he moves this rook to b8, so that simply he can give an exchange. But here, Bogoliubov realizes that his position has gone wrong and that he's not going to win this game, barring a catastrophe from Black. But he still has hope that he can get a draw by fortress because he's got everything on the same side of the board. Black isn't winning on the queen side here. And Bogolyubov is a great defender, and so he still believes that he can try to hold this position. And so he plays g4, trying to break through. Knight f3 check. So bishop takes, pawn takes. He takes on f5, queen e2, and now d5. So he gives away some pawns in order to try to create a fortress. He goes h5, king h7, e4. So the knight, because white is basically in Zugzwang, he's kind of out of move, so he has to push up the pawns. So the knight takes on e4, knight takes, queen takes, but now d6, so he gives up that pawn, f6. So for the moment, it looks as though white has gone mad. He's just giving away all his pawns. But what he's trying to do is to make the position fortressable. He wants to be able to keep his king here and move his rook back and forth and leave his knight on f1. And the position is actually such that white has everything covered. His pieces are in position to stop all of the black pawns from coming down the board. So he plays rook d2, but here Alekhine shows one of the key methods for breaking through a fortress, which is something that we've already touched on, and he plays queen to e2, sacrificing the queen in order to break the fortress. And here we see a situation which we've already seen earlier in this game. It's not so often that this situation comes up twice in one game, where this pawn has a double threat, not only of promoting, but also of capturing the knight. And in this case, white can't stop both, so he has to go king f2. But the problem is he's now left in a pawn endgame, a pawn down. And so Alekhine brings his king in as quickly as possible, and Bogolyubov resigns, recognizing that he's in a lost pawn endgame. There's no way that white can really try here. If he goes king e3, king f5, king f3 to try to lock him out, but here after d4, white would be in Zugzwang and forced to resign. So everyone, I hope you've really enjoyed this video series. It's been an absolute pleasure for me. I've really enjoyed going through these games, these incredibly fun and interesting games. And I hope it's been a fun experience for you, and I hope that you've learned a lot. So I'd like to revisit some of the key points that we discussed in this video. So first, we learned the very important imbalance of knight versus bishop, and in what situations a knight is stronger, and in what situations a bishop is stronger. And so let's revisit some of those key points. So a bishop tends to be stronger than a knight when the position is open. Basically, in any position where time is a factor, where you don't have all day, that favors the bishop because the bishop is a faster piece than the knight. So open positions are better for bishops. Pawns on both sides of the board, especially passed pawns in the endgame, favor the bishop. The bishop tends to work very well with a rook. Rooks and bishops partner up really well. They make a power combo. The knight tends to be better when time is not a factor because the bishop has the weakness of only being able to cover one square, one color of square, given enough time, the knight can be a more effective piece because it can cover any square, regardless of color. The knight just needs enough time. So in kind of slow plotting positions where time is not a factor, the knight tends to be a more effective piece than the bishop. So basically the opposite of the positions that are more conducive to the bishop are in the knight's favor. So the bishop's better in open positions, the knight's better in closed positions, in positions that involve more maneuvering. That's better for the knight. So pawns on both sides of the board favor the bishop. Pawns on only one side of the board favors the knight, because the knight can be very strong in one area of the board, even more so than the bishop. So the knight's power combo is with the queen. The queen and knight work very well together and can create a lot of nasty checkmate attack possibilities. So the queen and knight are a power combo, whereas the rook and bishop are more the power combo. And also, when you're playing with a knight against a bishop, it's good to try to find and to create outposts for the knight. Knights normally need outposts in order to be able to compete with bishops on the open board. And conversely, if you're playing against the knight, it's good to try to deny that knight any outposts. Also, remember one key strategy of playing with the bishop is to try to put your pawns on the opposite color of the bishop, since pawns and bishops both control the board diagonally. It's useful to have them on the opposite color so that you can control more of the board. Because if your pawns and your bishop are on the same color, then whatever color they're not controlling is going to be a weakness in your position. Also, remember one important principle of playing against the two bishops' advantage. For example, if you're playing with a knight or a bishop, normally you want to trade minor pieces and play either bishop against bishop or play knight versus bishop, and try to use your knowledge of knight versus bishop to steer the position toward a favorable imbalance for you. Maybe you can create a closed position, or a position with pawns on one side of the board, or a position where your queen and knight coordinate really well together. So those are the key points for knight versus bishop. And in the second part of the video, we discussed compensation for a queen. And my main rules for having compensation for a queen are, first of all, you've got to have a safe king. The queen is such a powerful attacker that if your king isn't safe, you're not going to have a very good chance. Also, you want to have your pieces protected. If you have unprotected pieces, the queen is going to find tactical opportunities to exploit that and win material. So it's very important to have protected pieces, and also you want your pieces to coordinate. The queen is a powerful piece, but the queen's disadvantage is that it's only one piece. So very well coordinated pieces can play well against the queen and sometimes overpower the queen if they really work well together. Sometimes it's an advantage to have 2 or 3 pieces rather than one, even when the one piece is the queen. So I thank you for watching. I hope you've sincerely enjoyed this video series, and I hope that you've learned a great deal, and will join me in the future for more videos. This is Keaton Kira, signing off.